Sherlock Holmes and the Clue, Hidden in Blood. Chapter 1. It began not in the hush of Baker Street, nor under the grey veil of London fog, but rather beneath the searing glare of summer noon, in a crowded square near Piccadilly. The hour was just past 12, when Holmes and I found ourselves among a gathering throng at the unveiling of the Royal Antiquarian Society's newest exhibit, a ceremonial blade unearthed from beneath the ruined foundations of an ancient manor in Devonshire. The crowd, a peculiar mix of academics and aristocrats, swelled with murmurs as the mayor's voice droned from the podium. A band played faintly in the distance, its tune swallowed by the restless shuffle of spectators. "Do you find this sort of spectacle amusing, Holmes?" I asked, shading my eyes from the oppressive sun. "My amusement, Watson, is reserved for the aftermath," he murmured, scanning the crowd rather than the relic. "It is when order falters that the real story begins." He had barely spoken when it happened. A scream split the air. Sharp, human, panicked. I turned instinctively. The dignitary beside the mayor had collapsed, clutching at his throat. But no sooner had that drawn our gaze than another sound. A shout of alarm from the opposite side of the exhibit sent the crowd into frenzy. "There!" someone cried. "The man in the grey suit! He vanished!" I pushed forward through the surging mass, Holmes at my side like a shadow. Several onlookers pointed to a section of raised platform where a tall, grey-suited gentleman had been standing not a moment earlier, directly in front of a bronze statue. Now, only empty air and the polished floor remained. "No door," Holmes muttered, circling the area. "No curtain, and no plausible exit." 2 constables tried in vain to restore order. "Back, all of you! This is a crime scene now!" Indeed, woman in a lace-trimmed dress clutched my sleeve. "He was just there, I swear it." He nodded to me, and then nothing. The mayor barked orders, the band ceased, and within minutes the exhibit was sealed off. Holmes crouched near the statue's base, tapping the tiles with the handle of his cane. He rose, brow furrowed. "Watson, you saw him?" "I did, briefly. He stood no more than 15 feet from us. And now, a vanishing act in full view of 100 witnesses." His eyes narrowed. "Far too theatrical for chance." Scotland Yard arrived with its usual promptness, and with it came an all-too-familiar face. "Blast it, Holmes," Inspector Hopkins grumbled, stepping over the rope. "Couldn't even enjoy my lunch." Holmes offered a thin smile. "You'll forgive the interruption, Inspector, but I believe your man did not simply vanish. He was removed." Hopkins looked up sharply. "Removed? In full view of half the city?" Holmes walked the perimeter, noting scuff marks, a crumpled pamphlet, and the twisted angle of a velvet rope. "It is not the vanishing that troubles me. It's the message." "What message?" He pointed to the statue's pedestal, etched crudely in red across its base. Blood, not paint, were 4 words. "He dies for truth." We remained at the scene for hours. The missing man's identity, it seemed, was as baffling as his disappearance. No name, no companions, no papers. Only a grey suit, a vanished presence, and blood. "I have seen sleight of hand, Watson," Holmes said as we departed. "But this is not illusion. It is declaration. You believe it was murder? I believe it was theatre, with death in the second act." Chapter 2. By the following morning, The newspapers had fastened themselves to the mystery with predictable hunger. "Gentleman disappears before public eye," read the Daily Gazette, while the Telegraph rather melodramatically referred to it as the vanishing horror of Piccadilly. Yet for all their sensationalism, the facts remained sparse. No body, no name, no witnesses who could agree on anything beyond his grey suit and height. Only the blood-written message, "He dies for truth," clung to the affair like a ghostly whisper. Holmes had not slept. I awoke to find him at the breakfast table, fingers ink-stained, poring over the Society's guest registry from the previous day's event. "Anything?" I asked, pouring tea. "Too many things," he replied without looking up. "But the trail narrows." He tapped a name on the registry. Lavinia Harrow, widow, gave no address, claimed to be presenting on behalf of her late husband's bequest. Yet the Society claims no record of such a contribution. Curious, don't you think? I nodded slowly. And the name? Holmes pushed his chair back. Invented, I believe, but she left a calling card. From his inner pocket he produced a folded note, a delicate cream paper, smelling faintly of violet, with a single line, in slanted script. "The blood will speak louder than truth ever could." Below it, L.H. She slipped this into the suggestion box at the exhibit. Holmes continued. "I bribed the janitor. She was warning us, or daring us." We arrived at number 43 Weatherden Row, an aged boarding house in Marylebone that sagged slightly in the middle as if it carried too many secrets. The landlady, a hunched woman with chalk on her sleeves, recognized the name instantly. "Miss Harrow?" "Took the top room, she did. Quiet, always paid in cash. Left yesterday. Evening. Said she'd not be returning." Holmes examined the entry log, then turned to me with the faintest glimmer of anticipation. "Let us inspect the remains of her absence." The room was sparse. Iron bed, cracked mirror, a single chest beneath the window. But it was the writing desk that drew Holmes like iron to magnet. "She wrote something here," he murmured, running a gloved hand across the surface. "Recently. Ink grooves are fresh." He knelt, examining the waste bin. There, beneath torn receipts and a scorched match, he found what he sought. A letter. Torn, but not shredded. The envelope unsealed, yet its contents strangely intact. He laid the pages flat on the bed and began piecing them together. I leaned over his shoulder. "Dearest Lawrence, I've done all I can. They've taken everything. His name, his records, even the coroner's report. I am left with nothing but this letter and my guilt. You said the blood would speak, but I fear it already has, and we were not meant to hear it. If you find this, do not come looking. I believe they will erase me next." L. Holmes read it twice, then stood, eyes distant. "She feared obliteration," he said. "Not death, mind you, but erasure. To be wiped from the page entirely." "She mentions Lawrence," I pointed out. "Perhaps her husband." Holmes shook his head. "No. If she was writing to Lawrence, then he lives. But someone else is dead, and it was someone whose existence has been deliberately expunged." A silence settled between us. Then Holmes turned sharply. "Watson, what do you make of the ink?" I examined the letter again. Blue-black, faded slightly at the edges. Holmes sniffed the parchment. Pine oil. It was written with theatre ink. Theatre ink? He nodded. used to darken false wounds on stage. It fades quickly, dries poorly, and is often laced with resin. No ordinary writing tool. She intended this to vanish. He reached into his coat, removing the blood-stained pamphlet from the exhibit. I have a theory, Watson, but I must confirm it through contradiction. Come, we are due at the Royal Theatre. The Royal Theatre, grand as ever beneath its vaulted dome, had not yet opened for the evening performance, but Holmes's reputation was currency enough to gain us entry. We were ushered backstage, where Holmes began methodically inspecting paint trays, wardrobe stations, and make-up benches. He paused at a basin stained with reddish residue. He dabbed a cloth, held it to his nose, then smiled faintly. The same resin. She wrote her warning with this. From a shelf, he took a prop blade, eerily similar to the one unveiled at the exhibit, and weighed it in his hand. Watson, do you recall the man's gesture before he vanished? He lifted his hand, as if waving or signalling, I said slowly. Holmes nodded. It was a cue. He turned to the theatre's pulley rigging above the stage. Someone beneath him, a stagehand perhaps, was waiting for that cue. You mean he vanished? Through the floor? Precisely. He pointed upward. The exhibit was built atop an old stage, beneath the statue. A hidden trapdoor, long abandoned, or so we thought. But who would orchestrate such a thing? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He held up a fragment from the torn letter again. I believe they will erase me next. He tapped the word they with his fingernail. We're not dealing with a single murderer, Watson. We're dealing with a group, a hidden hand that edits reality. As we stepped back into the fading afternoon light, I felt the weight of something vast and unseen pressing in around us. The kind of pressure that came not from violence, but from absence, from stories removed before they could be told. Holmes walked silently, deep in thought. Then, without looking at me, he murmured, There is blood, Watson, but no body. A woman's warning, but no woman. A name whispered, but no man to answer to it. And now, a theatre without an audience, putting on a play only the dead can see. A chill passed through me despite the warmth. Do you think she's still alive? Holmes paused, then turned his gaze skyward. I think she is precisely where they want her. Somewhere between the truth and the edit. Before we proceed, next part of the story. Quick question, detectives. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're piecing together the clues with us, subscribe, because this case takes a shocking turn very soon. Chapter 3. The next day dawned under an oddly pale sky, a washed-out canvas that seemed to reflect the strange hollowness of our investigation. We returned to Baker Street early, and I confess that the events of the past 2 days had begun to weigh heavily on my mind. A man had vanished in plain sight. A widow had written a letter meant to vanish. And now Holmes hinted at the existence of a conspiracy vast enough to erase names from the fabric of reality. I do not believe in ghosts, I muttered aloud while stirring my coffee. But this affair feels as though we are chasing one. Holmes, seated cross-legged on the divan, did not respond at first. He was sketching, a rare act, and never for leisure. His eyes flicked from his drawing to the copy of the event diagram taken from the exhibit. His pencil scratched with precise, surgical strokes. Finally, he said, You are not wrong, Watson. But consider this. Ghosts are simply memories that no longer belong to anyone. I blinked. What are you suggesting? That the man who vanished was not murdered, nor kidnapped, but deleted, unwritten. I stared at him. Holmes, that borders on the theatrical. He offered a faint smile. Then it matches the crime perfectly. At 11 o'clock, our next visitor arrived, not through the front door, but through a back alley Holmes had unlocked in anticipation. He was thin, harried, and carried the air of a man hunted by shadows. His coat was too large for his frame, and a patch of dried blood lingered at the edge of his cuff. "Your name?" Holmes asked as I closed the shutters. The man hesitated. "It won't help. I've used 3 names in the past week. None of them stick." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then let us discuss the name that was taken from you." The man exhaled and pulled a folded newspaper from his inside pocket. It was yesterday's edition of the Chronicle, the one that had reported the Piccadilly disappearance. "Look at the photograph," he said. Holmes and I leaned over. It was the ceremonial blade being unveiled. In the background stood a crowd of attendees. "There," the man whispered, pointing. "That's me. And yet they say I wasn't even present." His finger trembled as he tapped the image. "I remember being there. I remember the man in grey. I remember the scream. But now, my landlord swears I never left the house. My employer claims I quit a fortnight ago. My name's been overwritten." Holmes studied the man for a long time, then turned to me. "Watson, would you kindly fetch the file from the Scoville archive, the one on the triad silence?" My breath caught. I hadn't heard that name in years. "You think this is connected to that old urban myth?" "I think," Holmes said, "we are no longer in the realm of myth." The triad silence had been a whisper passed between constables. In the darker corners of the yard, rumours of an intelligence network buried within the British bureaucracy. Not an agency, but a mechanism. Anonymous, faceless, and silent. Whenever a case became too entangled with those in power, a pattern emerged. Files missing, witnesses recanting, names vanishing. Back in the flat, Holmes laid out 3 pieces of evidence: the blood-scrawled statue photograph, the widow's letter written in disappearing ink, and the man's newspaper clipping. "Note the consistency," he said. "Each thread vanishes, but only after it has been seen. Our enemy does not conceal. It edits." The visitor looked up sharply. "Then I'm next, aren't I?" Holmes leaned forward. "Only if we allow the narrative to continue as written." Pulled open a drawer and revealed a sealed envelope. "Watson, do you recall that anonymous letter we received 6 weeks ago? The one warning of a blood prophecy in the heart of London?" I nodded. We had dismissed it as one of many cryptic cranks. Holmes opened the envelope with deliberate care. Inside, in the same slanted handwriting as Lavinia Harrow's letter, was a single line: "They erase not the guilty, but the remembered." Later that afternoon, Holmes and I paid a visit to the British Library. Not for books, but for absence. He took me straight to the archives of medical registries. "Help me," he said. "Look for Lawrence Harrow. Physician. Died 2 years ago. We spent over an hour combing through bound volumes, faded ledgers, and brittle pages. There were Harrows aplenty. Engineers, shoemakers, even a chemist from Shrewsbury. But no Lawrence Harrow. "He was a doctor," Holmes said softly. "And yet not a single entry, not a single death certificate, not even a license. He replaced the book with care. They have erased his name not just from memory, but from the architecture of record." "And Lavinia's letter?" I asked. "Do we even know if she was ever married?" "We don't," Holmes replied grimly. "But she remembers, and perhaps that is why they've come for her." We returned to Baker Street just as the clouds began to gather, a strange green-tinted sky churning above London. The man without a name had gone, disappearing as suddenly as he arrived. Holmes watched the rain begin to fall with an expression I could not place. "This case will not end in a courtroom," he said at last. "No?" I asked. He turned toward me, the light of the fireplace flickering in his eyes. "No, Watson. This one ends in silence, or in defiance." That night, long after Holmes had retired to his violin, and I to my medical journals, I found myself haunted not by what we knew, but by what we couldn't prove. A vanished man, a missing name, a widow who may never have existed, and a blood-written message warning of a truth too dangerous to remain recorded. What disturbed me most was not the conspiracy itself, but the simplicity of its mechanism. Not force, not violence, but deletion. Not murder, but unmaking. As I blew out the candle beside my bed, I thought I heard Holmes muttering to himself, his voice just audible through the wall. "Not everyone who bleeds is remembered, but every name they erase leaves a mark behind." Chapter 4. It was just past 6 o'clock when a soft, measured knock came at the door of 221B Baker Street. Holmes was in the midst of dissecting a rare Egyptian beetle gifted to him by a collector in Kent, an exercise in distraction, I suspected, more than interest. He did not look up when I opened the door. Standing on the threshold was a boy, no more than 12. His cheeks flushed from cold, a tightly folded slip of paper clutched. "In his hand, for Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly. "A lady in green gave it me. Said I weren't to read it. Said it were important." Holmes took the slip with a glance. His fingers paused halfway through unfolding it. I saw the moment his posture stiffened. "It's begun," he murmured. Leaned in. The paper bore a single line. "Lawrence was only the first. You are next if you do not stop digging." And below, drawn in deep red ink, a circle, bisected by a vertical line. A mark I had never seen before. Holmes tapped the symbol with his fingertip. "This, Watson, is the first physical mistake they've made. A symbol, a signature. And signatures crave recognition. Within the hour, we were aboard a hired carriage bound for Whitechapel. Holmes had connected the mark to a seldom referenced file, one he kept beneath a false drawer, labelled only with a single numeral. 13. Inside were newspaper clippings from the unsolved cases, each curiously linked by sudden redactions, untraceable victims, and mentions of the committee in passing. But one clipping stood apart. "A vicar named Edgar Niles," Holmes explained as the wheels clattered beneath us. "Found dead in his study 3 years ago. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, but drawn in blood on the church door, this very symbol. And what was the motive? Unknown. But his final sermon, according to a surviving page, warned of a system of forgetting, a machinery for unmaking history." The words echoed in my mind like distant thunder. When we arrived at the old vicarage, we found the building abandoned, save for the caretaker, a wiry man with grey hair and a cautious gait. "You're here about Reverend Niles, then?" he asked. "Don't get many asking after him." Holmes nodded. "We understand he kept his records in the chapel archives?" The caretaker glanced sideways. "You won't find them there. The night he died, they all vanished. Not burned, just gone." "Gone?" I said. "You mean stolen?" "No, sir, just gone. Drawers empty, shelves untouched, as though they'd never been written." Holmes circled the dark chapel interior. Dust hovered like breath in the moonlight slanting through stained glass. He paused at the lectern and tapped his cane against the wood. "Someone stood here," he said quietly. "Recently." He knelt, brushed the flagstone floor with his palm, then peered beneath the lectern's step. From the shadows, he retrieved a torn scrap of parchment, almost missed entirely, scrawled upon it, barely legible. "They are not a society. They are an edit. They do not kill. They reframe." And beneath it, the same symbol. I felt a chill crawl across my back. Holmes turned the parchment in his hand, then brought it to his nose. "Lavender oil," he said. "The same perfume on Lavinia Harrow's letter. She was here." Holmes's voice was low. "She never left. She's been trying to outpace her own erasure. Each note, each signature, proof she ever existed. But she knows the rules. She knows she must stay, slightly visible." He held up the note again, and now she's left us a scent trail. We returned to the carriage in silence, the shadow of something colossal now hanging over the case. Not just conspiracy, but a philosophy. One enacted with surgical precision. "What do they want, Holmes?" I asked. "Why unmake people? Why erase?" Holmes did not answer for a long time. Then, "Because power does not lie in killing. It lies in rewriting." Back at Baker Street, a surprise awaited us. A parcel. Brown-wrapped, string-bound. No sender's name. Inside, a photograph. Cracked at the edges. A dinner party scene. 8 people around a candlelit table. Only one face remained untouched. Lavinia Harrow. The others blurred with sharp mechanical precision. Burned, scrubbed or scratched out. Holmes studied it under the gaslight. "This was not destruction," he said. "It was curation. The photo has been altered, selectively. But look here." He pointed at a wineglass, a smudge of red. "Watson, bring me the widow's letter again." I did so, and he held the photo beside the inked warning. Same hue, same chemical properties. The blood in this photo is not symbolic. It's literal. Someone bled here, and then was erased from the memory of their own death. His voice dropped. And yet Lavinia remained. It was then the knock came again. But this time urgent, hollow, knuckles against wood that meant fear. I opened the door, and there she stood impale, trembling, eyes wide with terror. "Lavinia Harrow, I don't have long," she whispered. Holmes stepped forward. "You wrote the letters, left the warnings," she nodded. "They let me live, because I was never meant to be remembered. Why come to us now?" Her eyes met Holmes', desperate. Because you're already being erased. Chapter 5. Lavinia. Harrow sat at our hearth, like a woman returned from burial. Her fingers, stained faintly red, trembled against the teacup I handed her. She had spoken those words, "You're already being erased," with such quiet finality that for a moment even Holmes had stilled. I could see it in his eyes, the rarest flicker of uncertainty. "I can't stay long," she said again, there, watching every address I've ever spoken aloud. Holmes folded his hands before him. "Then let us waste no syllables. Who are they?" Her eyes darted to the window, then back. "They don't have a name, not one they keep for long, but among those who know, they're called the Proofmakers." I frowned. "That sounds paradoxical." "It is," she replied, "because they don't make proof. They replace it." She reached into the folds of her coat and produced a page torn from a journal. Faded ink, lined parchment, and 3 words scrawled across the top. "My name is Lawrence. I found this," she whispered, "in a locked drawer. My husband's old desk. They left everything else untouched, but not this." Holmes examined the note with care. His fingers brushed over the dried ink. "This writing, it's layered. Look here, Watson." I leaned over. The L in Lawrence had been written twice, slightly misaligned. "They tried to remove the name," Holmes said, "but the ink fought back." Lavinia nodded. "That's why I came to you. Because the memory resisted. Something deep, personal, not written in a file or a report, but in blood." Her voice faltered. "He died remembering, and that they couldn't delete." The silence that followed was immense. Even the street outside felt muted, as though London itself were listening. Holmes stood and began pacing. "This confirms a hypothesis I formed days ago," he said. "The mechanism of erasure is surgical, but not omnipotent. It fails in the face of emotional permanence. Love, fear, guilt, these things etch memory deeper than record." He turned to her. "They removed his death certificate, his medical records, his name from public roll, but your grief remained. That's the only reason we're still in the game." She met his gaze. "Then what do I do?" Holmes paused. "You disappear." She blinked. "What?" "You disappear intentionally, not as prey, but as a ghost with purpose. We give them nothing else to redact." He turned to me. "Watson, we'll send her to Mrs. Fanshaw's retreat in Southsea. No names, no records, a ghost among the living." "But for how long?" I asked. "Until we burn their ledger," Holmes said. "Until we break their edit." An hour later, after Lavinia had been quietly escorted out under Holmes's cloak and a false name, I turned to him. "You believe this Proofmakers group maintains a ledger?" "I believe they must," he replied. "To erase truth, one must first know it. Every removed name, every altered scene, it must all be recorded somewhere, hidden, guarded. And if we find it," he glanced at the fire, "then we make memory undeniable." That evening, Holmes and I visited the office of Harold Vexley, a retired solicitor who had once handled internal estate affairs for the Royal Antiquarian Society, the same society that had hosted the ill-fated exhibit where this all began. "I trust this is more than a social call, Mr. Holmes?" Vexley asked with a wry smile. Holmes held up a copy of the guest registry from the exhibit. "Did you authorize these names?" Vexley peered through his spectacles. Some, yes, but this one. He tapped Lavinia Harrow's name. I don't recall. And this man? Holmes pointed to the one immediately above hers. Jonas Vale. Vexley nodded slowly. Strange fellow. Claimed to be a historian. Had a northern accent, but no card, no university affiliation. Brought a sealed envelope, insisted it be placed in the archives, unopened. Holmes stiffened. Archives? You mean the Society's locked vault? Precisely. We were there by midnight. Aided by a skeleton key Holmes had no legal right to possess. We slipped into the bowels of the Royal Antiquarian Society. The archive vault was colder than the air outside. Metallic shelves loomed in long rows, each marked by a decade, a nation, or a civilization long gone. Holmes moved with the precision of instinct. He passed Egypt, Mesopotamia, Tudor England, and stopped at a drawer labelled Private Acquisitions, unsorted. From it, he withdrew a single black envelope, unmarked, wax-sealed. He turned it over and drew in a breath. The seal bore the same symbol. We had seen twice now, the circle and vertical line. Holmes broke it. Inside, no letter, no photographs, only a thin strip of vellum, coarse and yellowed, and upon it dozens of names faded, scratched out, rewritten, and in the very centre, L. Harrow in flux. Holmes whispered, "Their ledger." Suddenly, a noise. Footsteps in the hall. Holmes tucked the strip into his coat and drew his revolver. A silhouette passed across the vault's narrow window. Another set of footsteps, then silence. Holmes moved swiftly to the door, cracked it open, and froze, pinned to the other side of the door with a thin brass tack. A note. 2 words only. Too late. Chapter 6. The note remained pinned to the vault door like a nail through. Our intentions too late. Holmes read it without a word, his expression unreadable. He removed it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket beside the strip of vellum. The ledger we now knew to be real, and more chillingly, active. They were here, I whispered, watching, listening. Holmes gave a single nod, and they let us find this, which means either they've already moved the true ledger, or what we hold is bait. We slipped out of the Antiquarian Society the way we came, weaving through moon-slick alleyways and side streets. The strip of names pressed tight against Holmes's chest, as if proximity might keep them alive. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the vellum on the table beneath the lamplight and studied the names by category. Each was grouped under a word, faded, removed, in flux. The ink varied slightly, suggesting many hands had worked on the list. But something else caught my eye. "Holmes," I said, pointing. "Here, W. Trenholm. Status refused." He leaned in, eyes narrowing. Refused. Fascinating. A name that fought back. He paced once, then stopped. "Watson, do you recall the Trenholm case?" "The composer," I said after a moment's thought. "The one who vanished from the opera hall 2 winters ago? They claimed he drowned himself, but no body was ever found." Holmes nodded. "I received an anonymous note about that case. A phrase, 'Even silence can scream if the name beneath it will not fade.' I dismissed it as poetic madness at the time." "Do you think it was them?" I think it was someone within them. Someone who disagreed. He tapped the name again. This is what they fear, Watson. Not exposure, but resistance. People who cannot be unwritten. At Holmes's insistence, we paid a visit to the Opera Hall the next morning. It was a grand building that had aged with defiance, its arches and marble columns weathered but unyielding. The hall manager, a Mr. Ketteridge, greeted us stiffly, clearly, unnerved by Holmes's reputation. I was under the impression the Trenholm case had been closed, he said. Then allow us to pry it open, Holmes replied. We wish to inspect the room where he last practiced. The manager hesitated, but relented. Room 12. It was narrow and high-ceilinged, filled with dust and a piano that had not been played in months. Yet something felt occupied. Holmes went straight to the floorboards near the window, tapping lightly with his cane. One board gave a hollow sound. He pried it up. Inside, a small metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Within the box, manuscript sheets, notes, a torn sleeve soaked with dried blood, and a wax cylinder for a phonograph. Holmes examined the sleeve. W. Trenholm's initials. Blood, though long dried. But what's more important, this box was hidden after his disappearance. I turned the cylinder in my hand. Could this be a message? Holmes nodded. Only one way to know. Back at Baker Street, he set the phonograph needle upon the wax. The hiss of static gave way to a voice. Tired, hoarse, but unmistakably human. If this reaches anyone, I was not mad. They came for me because I wrote something I shouldn't have remembered. A melody, a phrase from someone erased. But the notes were still in me, still mine. They couldn't destroy them. A pause. They offered silence. But I made my choice. Let the name live through the blood, through sound, through ink. Even if they take me, let someone, anyone, remember. Then a final note, a single piano key, struck 3 times in slow succession. Holmes stopped the machine. Trenholm resisted, he said quietly. He encoded his memories not in records, but in music. And someone in the system refused to erase him, marked him, refused. That's why the cylinder remained. I felt the skin on my arms rise. So what now? Holmes stared into the fire. Now we know their flaw. That evening, Holmes assembled a list, a short one. 3 names, all marked refused in the ledger. Each one connected by acts of creation, an artist, a composer, and a writer. Holmes's theory was simple but staggering. The mind cannot forget what the soul creates. A song, a scent, a grief. The deeper it's written into a man's essence, the harder it is to remove. These people were not just remembered. They remembered themselves. At midnight, a note slid beneath our door. Not sealed, not signed. It read, "You are remembering things that never happened. This is your final edit." Below it, a blank space. Where my name should have been, I read it once, twice. Then turned to Holmes with a dry throat. "They've begun with me." Holmes said nothing, but his knuckles were white around the ledger. Chapter 7. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind flickering with names I wasn't certain were mine. A cruel thought took root. What if I'm already gone? What if Holmes remembers me only because he refuses not to? At first light, I found Holmes seated at the desk in his robe, the ledger open before him, and a dozen books scattered around. Philosophy, code theory, even theological texts. He did not look up as he said, "You're still here, Watson." A simple statement, but it steadied me more than I'd have liked to admit. "Am I?" I asked, voice low. "They left my name blank, Holmes." "They tested you," he replied, "but it didn't take." He gestured to the list of refused names. Every one of these people anchored themselves through meaning. Acts that outlived facts. "You've written hundreds of pages about me, Watson. Thousands of words. If they tried to delete you, they'd have to rewrite me entirely. And I'm afraid," added dryly, "I'm not so easily redacted." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "But they won't stop," I said. "They've tried subtlety. Now they'll grow bold." Holmes finally met my eyes. "They already have." An hour later, Inspector Hopkins arrived at our door, visibly shaken. "You've been listed, Holmes," he said, glancing over his shoulder as though someone might be following him. "There's talk. Unofficial, of course. But I heard it myself in the Commissioner's office. Your name's been flagged as unverified asset. It's bureaucratic code for erase at will." Holmes accepted this news with eerie calm. "Do they mention why?" "Only whispers," Hopkins said. "Something about falsified cases. An accusation that some of your most public successes never occurred at all. And—" He hesitated. "What is it?" I prompted. Hopkins looked at me. "They say Dr. John Watson died in Afghanistan. A decade ago." My mouth went dry. I looked at Holmes, then at the inspector. "That's a lie. Of course it is," Hopkins said quickly. "But they're rewriting the records. I saw the memo. They're calling your memoirs unauthenticated accounts." "Holmes, they're preparing to bury you both." Holmes said nothing. Then, after a long moment, he murmured, "So, they've reached the pen." That afternoon, Holmes insisted we pay a visit to the office of the Strand magazine. Editor Walter Rickwell greeted us nervously, his eyes bloodshot, hands wringing. I received a request from a legal authority," he stammered. "They asked for your entire catalogue of submissions, Mr. Holmes. Claimed it was part of a historical accuracy audit. But then—" Holmes raised a hand. "They asked you to redact." Rickwell nodded and opened a drawer. Inside, stacks of edited proofs, pages where my name had been blotted out, replaced with footnotes, titles changed, cases altered beyond recognition. "They're rewriting history," I said softly, replacing it with silence. Holmes turned to Rickwell. "Do you still have the original manuscripts?" "Of course," he whispered. "In the basement vault, untouched." "Good," Holmes said. "Lock them tighter. Because if they succeed, those stories will be all that's left of us." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out a strategy. They erase by narrative, Watson. That is their tool. And now they've reached ours. He picked up the wax cylinder from Trenholm's box. But this, we now understand, is their flaw. Truth etched in emotion. Suffering, memory, art, the uneditable. He retrieved the blood-written pamphlet from the exhibit, Lavinia's letters, the strip of names, and even the photograph with its missing faces. All of it, he said, connected by one core defiance, remembrance. I nodded. So what do we do? We write a sentence they cannot erase. Holmes's plan was both unorthodox and brilliant. We would submit an anonymous manifesto, co-written by Lavinia, Holmes, myself, and the few refused names Holmes had, quietly contacted since discovering the ledger. An open document titled The Blood Index, a record of the unforgotten, each name, each erased detail, each memory etched in unfiltered human grief. Holmes would send it to every paper, every university archive, every librarian with a conscience. It would exist everywhere and nowhere, published under no name, owned by no entity, distributed too widely, too wildly to be deleted. Once read, Holmes said, it cannot be unseen. It will live inside the minds of those who read it, and that is where they cannot follow. I stared at the first page, at the title in Holmes's spidery handwriting. They came to edit the world. We answered with blood. It was midnight when we posted the final parcel. Holmes sealed it himself, wax dripping like drying blood. He stood in the foggy street, eyes glinting in the lamplight. They'll come harder now, I said. They always do, he replied. We returned home to find the door ajar. A figure waited in the sitting room, calm, pale, dressed in black, without dust or wrinkle. You shouldn't have written it, the figure said. Holmes didn't blink. Then you shouldn't have bled so loudly. The man stood. It won't change the outcome. Holmes stepped forward. You mistake me for someone seeking victory. I seek only memory. And that, sir, you cannot kill. The man's eyes narrowed. We erase, and we replace. Holmes tilted his head. Do you know what's stronger than deletion? Silence. A sentence spoken aloud, Holmes said. Repeated, remembered, and passed on. He raised his voice. Watson lives. Harrow lives. Trenholm lives. The figure flinched. Holmes smiled. You've already lost. The man left without another word. And Holmes turned to me, face drawn but victorious. Watson, he said, write everything. Leave nothing behind, even this moment, especially this moment. I nodded, and I did. Chapter 8. The morning after the shadowed intruder's departure was unremarkably bright. One of those rare London days when the sun dares to spill across rooftops like it still belongs. Yet there was something fragile about the light, as if it had pushed through only briefly before retreating behind the veil again. Holmes stood at the window, his arms folded behind his back, staring into the busy street. They didn't stop us, I said. They came into our home and left empty-handed. Correction, Watson, Holmes murmured. They came into our home and left a breadcrumb. He held up the note the intruder had discarded as he left. Beneath the wax seal, identical to the one used on the Proofmakers' ledger, was a faint watermark, barely visible unless tilted towards sunlight. I leaned in. The Thames Library Trust, I read aloud. Dockside branch. That can't be. Right, there's no library on the dockside. Holmes arched an eyebrow. Then it would be a perfect place to bury forbidden books, wouldn't it? By noon, we had made our way to the crumbling underbelly of the city, past shipping lanes, groaning warehouses, and rust-coated chains swaying from pulleys long abandoned. Few souls passed through that quarter without purpose, and none looked up as we descended the stone steps into a forgotten culvert marked only by a brass plaque green with time. Thames Public Archive. By appointment only, Holmes did not knock. The interior was dim, the scent of mildew and rotting parchment thick in the air. But it was not disuse, it was secrecy. We passed through a corridor lined with filing cabinets until a staircase led down into darkness. At its base, a vast chamber opened like the hollow of a cathedral. Shelves stretched floor to ceiling, loaded with papers, scrolls, ledgers, none labelled, none ordered, and in the centre, beneath a hanging bulb, sat a man, white-haired, ink-stained, and utterly still. He looked up as we approached. "You've come for the fragments," he said simply. Holmes nodded, "And for the ones still breathing." The man gestured toward a crate. "Everything they've tried to forget ends up here. A few of us. Keep the leftovers." Holmes reached. Inside, letters, legal transcripts, unsigned obituaries, snippets of censored poems, portraits without names. He lifted one item, a child's drawing of a house, beneath which was scrawled, "We lived here, Watson," Holmes said, voice quieter now. "This is it. This is the undercurrent. They erase from the top down, but the weight of memory sinks." Among the fragments, Holmes found what he had hoped for, a parchment marked with the Proofmakers' seal, but with a correction scrawled beneath in red ink. "Do not process Harrow. She's already looped. Deletion. Ineffective. Reassigned to spectral index." He turned to the archivist. "Who writes the red ink?" The old man looked away. "The ones who tried to stop it. Not many left now." Holmes gently placed the slip into his coat. "Then one of them is still alive, and they've been watching from inside." Outside, as we stepped back into the light, Holmes was already moving faster, his pace measured but tight with urgency. "They tried to delete Lavinia Harrow more than once," he said, "but failed. Her record kept reappearing, slipping back into systems even after removal." "Because of grief?" I asked. "Because someone rerouted her," Holmes said. "Someone inside their own structure." He held up the red ink slip. "This spectral index isn't a death file. It's a quarantine. A way to hide what cannot be destroyed. If we find that list, we find everyone they couldn't erase, and the person who's been preserving them." That evening, while I prepared notes for our next move, Holmes took a silent visitor upstairs alone. When he returned, his expression was unreadable, but there was something in his hand I recognized immediately. A red wax seal, the true Proofmaker insignia, but cracked down the middle. "They're splintering," Holmes said. "Someone among them no longer believes in the mission." And tonight he offered me a name. "A name?" "Of the man who oversees the ledger. The one who rewrites memory itself." I stood. "Who?" Holmes looked me dead in the eye. "Jonas Vale." I staggered back. "But that was the name above Lavinia's in the registry at the exhibit." "Precisely," Holmes said grimly. "He walked among us on the day of the first deletion. He was the deletion." He retrieved a photograph from the crate, the same one with the dinner table, and Lavinia Harrow in the centre. "There," Holmes pointed, "the man seated beside her. That is Jonas Vale." but his face was scratched out. Holmes nodded. Because he does the scratching. Suddenly, a thought formed in my mind. Terrible, slippery. If he walked into that exhibit with a name and left without one, Holmes, do you suppose he erased himself? Holmes smiled, but it was a bleak expression. Yes, the final act of control. The one who edits reality removed himself from it entirely. And that, Watson, is how he became untouchable. As the candle burned low in our sitting room, Holmes set a fresh page into my typewriter. He pressed one key, deliberate, a single letter, J, and beside it he wrote in ink, Jonas Vale, the editor who rewrote himself. Then he turned to me. We are no longer hunting a killer, he said. We are hunting a myth he made real. Chapter 9. It is a strange sensation, watching a man hunt a ghost who once had a name. Stranger still to realize that the ghost has edited himself into a myth, and the myth has begun editing back. Jonas Vale, I repeated, as Holmes paced before the fireplace. But how do we find a man who no longer exists? Holmes stopped. We don't, he said, eyes glittering. We find where he last existed, and examine what happened after. He turned to the map tacked above his desk, littered with pins, string, and annotated slips from the Ledger and Thames archive. He tapped one location near the southeast quadrant, an address I hadn't seen before. 23 Wellstone Crescent, he said. It belonged to a man named Elias Brookley, Vale's alleged cousin. Records list him as a historian of minor fame, until the records stop listing him at all. Holmes turned to me with that particular glint, part fire, part warning. If we find Brookley's home intact, we find Vale's last mirror. We reached the address just before dusk. The street was unremarkable, quiet. The house itself was narrow and slightly sagging, with ivy clinging to its brickwork like desperate fingers. The windows were shuttered, the front gate unlatched. Holmes took one glance at the threshold and frowned. No dust on the sill, he muttered. Someone's opened this door recently. He withdrew his revolver. I followed suit. We stepped inside. The air had the scent of paper and something colder, like wet stone or the underside of a grave. The sitting room was filled with shelves, yet none bore labels. The books were all bound in black or grey. Not titles, ledgers. Silent, identical, watchful. This isn't a home, I whispered. It's an archive. Holmes opened one of the ledgers at random. Blank. He tried another, then another. All empty. False decoys, he said, to mimic the illusion of documentation. He wants visitors to believe everything is recorded, when in truth it is reconstructed. In the far corner, a lone mirror stood propped against the wall. Its surface was tarnished but intact. Holmes approached it, then turned to me. "Watson," he said softly, "what do you see?" I looked. My own reflection slightly warped. You, me, the room. Holmes nodded. "And that's what you should see." Then he reached out and knocked twice on the mirror's edge. A soft click. The surface shifted. Holmes pressed against it, and the mirror gave way, opening like a door. Behind it, stairs descending into shadow. We moved downward in silence, the echo of each step absorbed by the thick air. At the base was a corridor, and at its end a room bathed in amber light. No windows, no lamps. The glow came from a device unlike any I'd seen. A circular table, its surface a shallow basin filled with clear liquid. Floating on top were slips of paper, their ink crawling slowly across the surface as though being written in real time. Holmes stepped forward and read aloud. Wellstone entered by S.H. and J.W. Ledger secured. Editor will adjust. I froze. It's writing us. Holmes nodded, his voice low. This is the live ledger, the true one. The story they want the world to believe, updated as actions unfold. And the editor? I asked. Vale? Holmes turned slowly. There, on the far wall, a frame hung crooked, a portrait. The paint had been scraped in broad strokes, but not entirely. A pale face, a red tie. One gloved hand raised, as if mid-speech. Beneath it, J.V. He built this, Holmes said, and then erased himself from it, leaving behind only the tool. He picked up one of the slips in the basin. Dr. John Watson. Status. Phantom contributor. Visibility pending. Holmes crushed it in his hand. Then he looked at the basin, and, in one swift motion, poured the entire inkwell beside it into the liquid. The words blurred. The paper dissolved. The ledger bled into itself. Stop editing me, Holmes said, almost to the air itself. A silence followed, heavy and absolute. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice. It's rude to rewrite another man's work. Turned Jonas Vale stood there. No weapon, no urgency, only presence. His face was thin, his hair silver, his posture casual, but there was something in his eyes that felt utterly foreign, as though he had lived through many identities and forgotten them all. Holmes stepped forward. I see you, Vale. Do you? Vale asked. Because most men only see what they're told. You, Holmes, you see danger in silence. That's why you've come so close. He gestured to the basin. You've disrupted the ledger, but it rewrites itself. It always does. But it cannot rewrite emotion, Holmes said. That's what your ledger never understood. Blood is not data, and memory is not ink. Vale smiled faintly, which is why it must be replaced. He stepped toward the basin, but Holmes was faster. With a cry, he drew a flask from his coat and smashed it into the device. Flames burst to life as the chemicals ignited. Vale lunged, but I intercepted him, driving my shoulder into his chest. We fell. The basin shattered beside us. Flames rose fast. Holmes grabbed my coat and pulled me back. Now, Watson! We scrambled up the stairs. The mirror swung shut behind us, just as the fire roared through the hidden room. From outside, smoke curled through the roof tiles. The archive was burning, and with it, the last living ledger. We never saw Jonas Vale again. The papers never reported the fire. No arrests, no funerals, not even a whisper. But days later, at Baker Street, Holmes found something unusual in our mail. A single page, no return address. You deleted me. Well, played. But the next editor is already watching. No name, no signature. Only one line at the bottom. There is always a Vale. Chapter 10. In the days following the fire at Wellstone Crescent, there was no public record of the event. No flames reported, no official inspection. The city, in its ever-watchful indifference, moved forward as if nothing had burned, and no one had ever lived there at all. Yet in our sitting room on Baker Street, I felt the burn still smouldering, in the way Holmes lingered longer at the window, in the silence between our conversations, and in the unspoken question that haunted the air, had we won, or merely paused the script, the note from Vale, if it was truly from him, sat on the mantel like a curse in a sealed envelope. Holmes had not touched it since its arrival. He said little, but I saw him watching it as one watches a crack in a mirror, unsure if it's finished spreading. Then, on the third morning, he spoke. "There is one more thing, Watson. One final thread." I looked up. "A threat?" "A thread," he repeated, "something I overlooked, not out of error, but instinct. I was afraid of what it might mean." He opened the ledger strip we had kept from the Thames archive, the one listing the erased names, and ran his fingers along the column, marked "Refused." "There's one name here," he said, "that never came up in our investigations. Intrigue, pointed. M.W. status. Initiated, then redacted." My stomach turned. "M.W., I murmured. "My initials." Holmes shook his head. "Not yours. Look again." He produced a folder I hadn't seen in weeks, one of my early notebooks, kept from before I ever published a single account of our cases. Inside, faded by time but unmistakably mine, was a half-written entry. Case never recorded. Man in red gloves, Mirror Street. Client refused to speak. Holmes insisted we not pursue further. Entry left, incomplete, and below it a single note jotted by me in frustration. Manuscript withheld. MWI looked at Holmes, my mouth suddenly dry. That case, the one we never spoke of again. Holmes nodded. Because we were warned, not by a man, but by an edit, a test, a prototype of what was to come. And you, Watson, wrote just enough to make it unerasable. But I never published it. No, he said, you remembered it, and that was enough. That afternoon we travelled to the British Library, not to retrieve, but to deposit. Holmes handed a sealed envelope to the archivist with specific instructions. The story of Vale, he said, and the unrecorded names, to be filed not under history, but fiction. That way, it cannot be erased by fact. But who will read it? I asked, once we stepped outside. Holmes allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Someone always does. Back at Baker Street, something strange occurred. While reviewing my notes from the past week, I noticed something amiss. A page was missing, not torn out, simply gone. The date, the day we first met Lavinia Harrow, the record of our conversation, had vanished. The ink, the imprint, nothing remained. I turned to Holmes. They're still reaching in. He nodded. But look, he said, holding up a photo I didn't recognize. It was Lavinia, seated in a sunlit garden. Her eyes closed, a peaceful expression on her face. The retreat in Southsea, Holmes said. The matron sent this. She's safe. Memory anchored by simplicity, by peace. I held the photo as one holds a match in a windstorm. They'll try again, I said quietly. They always do, Holmes replied. That evening we received one final visitor, a child, perhaps 10, wearing a messenger's cap far too large for his head. He handed Holmes a small parcel, wrapped in faded red cloth. "From a man who said he was never here," the boy muttered. Inside, a mirror fragment, smooth, clean, but across its surface, in hurried ink. "The editor lives only when—" No one writes back. Holmes placed it on the mantel beside the sealed note from Vale. He then turned to me and said, "Watson, write back." I stared at him. He nodded. "Let the story answer the edit." And so I did. Chapter 11. I began writing the moment Holmes said the words, "Let the story answer the edit." It was, perhaps, the strangest instruction he had ever given me. Not to investigate, not to confront, not even to observe, but to write, to preserve, to fight silence with syntax. And yet, even as I set pen to paper, I could feel something resisting me, ink that bled into nothing, sentences that vanished mid-formation. I would write a line, and 5 minutes later it would no longer be there. I turned to Holmes in alarm. "They're not just redacting records," I said. "They're targeting the act of writing itself." Holmes looked up from the mirror fragment on the mantel, his expression tight. "Because the written word is the final disobedience. It lives after death. It spreads without permission." He held up a small card I hadn't noticed before, one that had been tucked inside the red cloth bundle delivered by the boy. It was old, handwritten, scorched at the corners, I wrote. My own name once. It changed nothing. But when another did, everything unravelled. LHI read the initials twice. "Lavinia Harrow," I whispered. Holmes nodded. She didn't save herself. Someone else did. By remembering, he stood and walked to my desk where the ink refused to dry. We are not meant to be authors of ourselves. That's the crime they punish. But when another remembers you, they cannot undo it. That memory becomes a second heartbeat. I swallowed hard. So the final test, then, is not just to know the truth, but to preserve it outside of oneself. "Exactly," he said. "They can erase one voice, but they cannot silence a chorus." That night, something changed. The air in Baker Street thickened, as if weighted with watching. And then, just past 2 o'clock, the gaslights flickered, faded, and extinguished. Holmes stood immediately. No flames, no light. They're attempting to sever sensory connection. I lit a match. It hissed and died in the air. "Not a power outage," he murmured. "An erasure of fire itself. A message." And then, on the wall opposite the fireplace, it appeared, a sentence. Written not in ink or ash, but absence. "This is your final paragraph." Holmes stepped toward it, face unreadable. And then he laughed. It was not a laugh of amusement, nor even defiance. It was recognition. "You arrogant editor," he whispered. "You've made a mistake." I blinked. "What mistake?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes burning in the dark. "You've just confirmed something for me. You still need structure. Even the Proofmakers require a framework, an opening, a climax, and now a conclusion." He stepped forward and pressed his hand against the sentence, and with it vanished the wall behind it, a spiral stairwell leading downward, stone, old, unmapped. We descended in silence, breath held, boots echoing softly with each step. The air grew colder, thinner. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. At the base, a door, unmarked. Holmes pressed his fingers against the wood. "There," he said. "That's where the core is. The editor's true archive. Not the one they show, but the one they fear." He turned to me. "If I do not return, Watson, remember what I said." I frowned. "You're not going in alone." But Holmes shook his head. "You've already done the one thing they can't touch. You wrote me. That is why they've failed. Now let me finish this." And before I could argue further, he stepped through the door. It shut behind him. I waited. Seconds, then minutes, then longer. The silence was not still. It pulsed. It shivered. I felt time stretch, bend, blur. And then he returned and take. Eyes, wide coat torn, but alive. He held a single item in his hand, a torn page. At the top, in calligraphic black ink, Vale, Jonas. Below it, nothing. No date of birth, no obituary, no profession, just one word, scrawled in red, one that looked neither written nor printed. Placeholder. I stared. "You were right." Holmes nodded. Jonas Vale never existed. He was the edit's proxy, a human shell that the archive poured meaning into. The page was his soul, and when I pulled it, he ceased to be. I whispered, "You killed a ghost." Holmes said nothing for a long while. Then, "No, I killed the idea of a ghost." We emerged into Baker Street at dawn. The world continued, if nothing had ended or begun. But something had shifted. The ink on my desk no longer vanished. My notes remained. And when I opened the ledger one last time, my name was there, whole, spelled correctly, no longer in flux. Holmes stood by the window that morning, his gaze distant. "It won't be over," I said softly. "No," he agreed. "But they've learned something. That the final rewrite belongs to the remembered." I looked at the torn page again. Its edges singed, its contents empty. But what if they return? Holmes tilted his head, the faintest smirk on his lips. "Then we rewrite them back." Chapter 12. It was a week after the archive vanished. I use that word deliberately. Vanished. Not burned, not seized, not buried in bureaucratic silence. No, Wellstone Crescent was simply no longer there. The number no longer existed in city records. The lane skipped from 21 to 25. Passers-by swore there was never a house there at all, and when I traced our footsteps back, all I found was a bricked wall where once a threshold stood. Holmes said nothing of it, but I knew it rattled him in a way bullets and poisons never had. Back at Baker Street, things resumed a form of normalcy. The violin returned to its corner. My journals no longer lost their ink. Holmes even accepted a mundane case involving a vanishing cat and an irritated widow. Yet I felt the unfinished weight of it. That final page, the placeholder name, the sentence they tried to erase. One afternoon, while Holmes examined pipe ash beneath a magnifier, I found the courage to ask, "Do you believe Jonas Vale was ever real?" Holmes didn't look up. "No." "But you spoke to him." "I spoke to something wearing his name." He paused. "Do you remember what I said about ghosts?" I nodded. "That they're just memories that no longer belong to anyone." "Precisely," he said. "Jonas Vale was never a man. He was a vacuum, a suit stitched from forgotten threads. The Proofmakers needed a conductor, so they composed one. I felt a cold ripple in my chest. So who composed the composers? Holmes finally looked at me. Who edits the editor, Watson? Who gives permission to erase? That night, Holmes did something uncharacteristic. He lit the fire, poured us both a brandy, and brought out a wooden box I'd never seen before. It was etched with a single word in Latin, remanentia. What remains? Inside, scraps of cases never solved, names no client ever remembered, symbols that never made it into my written accounts. These, he said, are the stories that resisted deletion not through justice, but through defiance. He lifted one item, a playing card, a queen of spades, stained in red. "Do you remember her?" he asked. I frowned. "Should I?" He smiled faintly. "She died in 1887. Her killer was never caught. Her file was lost in a warehouse fire. But I remember. Because she wore that same scent Lavinia wore, violets and ink." He closed the box. "That's the final twist, Watson. We never solved this case." I blinked. "But we unravelled the network. We stopped the ledger. No," he said calmly. "We interrupted it. The machinery remains. Somewhere, someone else has taken up the pen." The following morning, I received a letter, unmarked. Inside, a page torn from the Times, dated 5 years into the future. Sherlock Holmes, the myth behind the fiction experts, reveal many cases attributed to the late detective were exaggerated or invented entirely by his companion, Dr. John Watson. New research suggests Holmes may never have existed as popularly described. I dropped the page. My hands were shaking. I looked at Holmes. He didn't need to read it. He already knew. That evening I found him by the fire again, tapping the edge of the empty mirror fragment that still sat on our mantel. "They're rewriting us from the future," he said, "not through fact, but through credibility." I whispered, "So what do we do?" He turned to me calmly. "We publish everything. We saturate the world in memory, flood the ink, drown the editors in so many versions of the truth that no singular lie can hold." He reached for my journal. "Write this story, Watson. Every word, every twist, even the parts that don't make sense. Especially those parts. Because the moment they stop making sense is the moment they're real." And so I wrote like a man possessed. Wrote through the unease, through the contradictions, through the missing dates and faulty clocks and smudged footprints, through Lavinia Harrow's perfume and Trenholm's cylinder and the ledger that bled. I wrote the vanishing man at the exhibit, the letters written in ink that was meant to disappear. Dieter, editor who never was, and when I finished, I didn't stop, because I knew what Holmes knew. This was not a case we solved. It was a case that wrote itself. We were merely the instruments. The final time I saw Holmes truly rattled was not during the chase, or the confrontation, or even in that flame-lit archive. It was weeks later when he received a small package with no sender. Inside, a manuscript bound in black leather, title embossed in gold, "The Last Case of Sherlock Holmes, a fictional recollection by Dr. John Watson." He opened it. Every word, every line was exactly as I had written it, but I had never published it. I had not shared a single draft. Holmes stared at the cover, then looked at me, and said very softly, They're not erasing us any more, Watson. He turned the page. They're republishing us. I do not know what that means yet. I only know that some stories are too dangerous to be hidden, and some truths, once written, refuse to fade. So if you are reading this, dear stranger, remember, Sherlock Holmes lived. I was there. I saw him bleed. I saw him burn their ledger, and I saw him smile at the fire. Not because the case was solved, but because it had been remembered. Final line. Holmes turned from the window, the wind rattling the panes. He lit a match against the hearth, eyes steady. Justice? He said softly. No, Watson, only the illusion of it. But memory, that's far more dangerous. End of chapter 12. End of story.